v.h.s.x? What do you mean?
Dead by Daylight. Millions of players, countless hours logged, and a massive catalog of iconic horror killers from movies and even games. On the surface, it looks like a horror game, but when you strip it down to what makes horror actually scary, Dead by Daylight falls short. Today, we're going to be breaking down why Dead by Daylight is not a true horror experience, why it feels more like a competitive asymmetrical multiplayer title, and how it compares directly to other horror games and movies that do deliver fear. To argue that something fails at fear, we first have to define what horror is. At its core, horror media, whether movies like The Shining or even games like Amnesia, The Dark Descent, relies on atmosphere, vulnerability, unpredictability, and emotional immersion. Horror isn't just monsters, it's the fear of the unknown, the powerlessness, and the unrelenting dread. There are a couple of different games that come to mind when we talk about things like that, such as Silent Hill, which has the psychological tension that brings and prioritizes unease and atmosphere over action. Another good example, Amnesia, which brings vulnerability and powerlessness, leaving the player feeling helpless against horrors and enhancing its fear. And even a more obscure example like PT, atmospheric and unpredictability are two things that come together to trap players in an endless, unstable loop where dread builds with no safe zones. These are the benchmarks of horror, and this is where Dead by Daylight struggles. When people say Dead by Daylight is scary, what they often mean is that I got startled once. Well, let's look at the actual structure of the game. One player as the killer with 4 players as survivors, with a loop of repairing objectives while avoiding the killer. That sounds intense, but the fear isn't coming from hard design, it's coming from the game's competitive tension. After enough matches, what used to be frightening becomes routine and strategic. Players are switching from how do I survive the nightmare to how do I optimize gen play and looping. This shift has been widely noted within both critical analysis and player discussions. The horror fades into competitive gameplay. Compare that with single player horror like Alien Isolation, where you never know when the alien will be around the corner. There's no strategy that removes the fear entirely. In true horror games, gameplay enhances fear. In Amnesia, hiding and resource scarcity amplify terror. In Silent Hill, sound designs and the eerie visuals will warp your sense of safety. The difference is in Dead by Daylight, survivors can loop endlessly to delay the killer. Killers can unload predictable abilities and patterns. And then, as a result, the matches become a game of attrition, not dread. The very moment the game becomes better understood, its horror elements become mechanical rather than emotional. A problem that is widely discussed in community spaces. Players report that once you know the meta, the horror fades. And that's a big deal. Most traditional horror games don't lose their fear factor just because you learned a pattern. They adapt the horror, you don't adapt out of it. Let's compare Dead by Daylight to horror films, like The Shining, for example, an instant classic, which uses long, creeping tension to unsettle you. What about a movie like Alien, which traps characters in a claustrophobic, unpredictable danger in the middle of space? Or even The Blair Witch Project, which builds dread through ambiguity and realism through the found footage medium. Horror films use pacing, silence, anticipation, and emotional investment. Dead by Daylight, once you know the game, removes most of these. The fear of what's around the corner becomes which window do I loop next. Even films that use jump scares, like A Nightmare on Elm Street, still build narrative dread to make those moments impactful. Dead by Daylight's jump scares rarely carry the emotional context needed to make them deeply disturbing. Let's look at some titles that do continue to scare players even after multiple playthroughs. You can look at Amnesia: The Dark Descent, a landmark psychological horror where sound, darkness, and vulnerability create consistent fear. Alien Isolation, an AI that adapts and stalks unpredictably, making every moment feel unsafe, which is deep within its code. That if you continue to repeat the same strategy over and over, it will continue to adapt, especially on the hardest difficulties. Cry of Fear, praised for its unsettling atmosphere and grim tone that stays oppressive throughout. Silent Hill, of course, for its psychological themes, incredible visuals, and even its music being some that offer some of the creepiest experiences. PT, that wasn't even a full game, an infamous horror loop that traps players in a nightmare hallway designed to warp their expectations. And you name it, you can probably think of other horror games that can follow through with these kinds of themes and ways to scare you. All these games rely on constant threat and psychological horror, not just competitive mechanics. I do want to be fair, though. Dead by Daylight does offer some horror things decently well. Iconic horror mashups, we can have characters like Ash Williams from Evil Dead can be chased down by Freddy Krueger while also getting healed by Jill Valentine from Resident Evil. Or even the Ghostface mask appearing in the game, or even Michael Myers coming together in one game and bringing recognizable fear aesthetics. There's even dynamic audio cues to really recreate that horror movie experience, like the Terror Radius music, which can create tension. Even the maps and atmosphere can have somewhat creepy environments with immersive sounds. For example, when you load into one of the farm maps, you have the squeal of a pig, or even the Auto Haven records with all the body parts strewn around. But the aesthetics aren't the same as genre fulfillment. A horror game needs to evoke fear, not just simulate it. So here's the core issue. Dead by Daylight's horror becomes hollow once the player stops being unfamiliar. Players online consistently discuss how fear evaporates after understanding mechanics, confirming that the objection isn't unique to a few people. If horror is something that only works once, can we really call the experience a horror game? Dead by Daylight is a horror-themed asymmetrical competitive game. It borrows elements from horror movies and games, and early play can absolutely be thrilling, but its design prioritizes game mechanics, over-tuned balance to only one side, and strategy over pure horror immersion. It's not that it isn't scary at all, it's that it stops being truly scary once the fear has been analyzed and looped into efficiency. And this even can be compared to other asymmetrical games that potentially could have maintained that same level of fear. And a couple examples we could bring out would probably be Friday the 13th. That really still maintains some of that fear factor because of how lethal that Jason was. Or even Texas Chainsaw Massacre for its unique way to bring in different abilities and upgrades, while simultaneously still being very, very terrifying to actually face the characters. Albeit a couple of hiccups like door stuns and things like that. Or other asymmetrical games that probably we don't have enough time to cover in this video. But all in all, Dead by Daylight looks scary. It even can sound scary, but it does not fulfill the core elements that define true horror. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit the like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what you think makes a game scary. All right, let's go ahead and read off our members from Patreon: Pro King 101, YouTube members: Cargan Falcon, Evil Blade, Cap Courteous, WTF You're Not J-Lo, Evil Peach, Cozy Bozy, Theo Endire, Dole Whip, Noxus, Zero Mocker, Jack, Christian, and Crow Vader. And for the Twitch, we have Final Girl Bunny, Leona Art, Zazabu, Evil Blade, Danica, Crow Vader, Cake is a Road, Zeneron, Ginsburg, Mr. Morik, Kevin, Zero Mocker, Ashai Boo, and Gryffindor. Appreciate you guys supporting. Really means a lot. If you want to become a member, you can go ahead and join through Patreon or YouTube members, or even sub on Twitch. See you guys in the next one.